what are the teams you see with the deepest position groups? Checking in from Corpus Christi, Texas. Bet they know Selena down there. Had an argument about Selena this week. I bet I can quote more of that movie than anyone in Corpus Christi. I'm just going to put it out there. All right, let's talk about Clemson's defensive line. This is not a new headline, Clemson having a deep defensive line, but see, they struggled, quote unquote, last year, and anyone buying into them being back and being a national championship contender this year believes that, in part because this may be the best defensive line in football. Obviously, I think it is the best defensive line in football. They got Brian Brzee back from injury. They got Miles Murphy. Those are two surefire first-round guys if they're healthy. Tyler Davis is there. He's a senior. Xavier Thomas is in that mix. Here's how deep they are. I saw Brad Crawford write this the other day. They're so deep that KJ Henry, who is not a bust, he is a fifth-year former five-star player. He's a rotational guy here. Again, I want to stress, he's not a bust. They're just so deep, that's the quality of player that they rotate. So Clemson, you know, when they've won those titles, one of the hallmarks has always been defensive line. It gets overshadowed sometimes because they happen to have names like Deshaun Watson or Trevor Lawrence. Defensive line was what was getting it done for them. If they do it this year, it'll be because the defensive line got it done for them. In Tuscaloosa, the linebacker room at Alabama is about as disgusting as it gets. I think they have the two best linebackers in college football. They got Will Anderson and they got Dallas Turner. I know everyone agrees on Anderson. I think by season's end, you're going to look at 15 there and think he's right there with Will Anderson. They are two phenomenal players. Chris Braswell, a former five-star guy, is third on this list and would be a premier pass rusher on any other team. That's just how deep they are. But I didn't say edge rusher. I said linebacker room, period. Henry To'oTo'o decided to return this year. But also Jalen Moody is still there. And then I want you to just look at the list. And if you're listening on podcast, let me read you some of these names. Deontay Lawson is just there. Kendrick Blackshear, who's one of the most impressive physical specimens you'll see in person. He's got calves roughly the size of this laptop screen. He's there. Demoy Kennedy is there. And then there's a name way down this list. Won't be down near the bottom for long. Jahad Campbell was a guy who rocketed up the recruiting rankings this past cycle, kind of like Will Anderson did. Remember Will Anderson, if you follow recruiting, he just every 24/7 Sports player ranking update in that cycle, he kept rocketing up and he ended up a top 10 player. Oh, by the way, there were some folks who claimed bias or homerism. You don't hear so much from those folks anymore. Jahad Campbell did that this last cycle. And Jahad Campbell ends up being a top 10 guy. When we talked to Nick Saban on that signing day show, he said some things about Jahad Campbell before he had ever practiced in Tuscaloosa, like I've heard him very few times refer to a freshman as. So, yeah, Jahad Campbell's just kind of there. That linebacker room's nasty. The offensive equivalent of this is the Ohio State wide receiver room. I want you to imagine this. I know so many of your programs out there are looking for a all-conference wide receiver, a all-American wide receiver, or an all-American wide receiver. Imagine watching Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson and Jamison Williams, really, if you want to count the transfer portal, all walk out the door in a year and still knowing you have by far the deepest wide receiver room in college football. Imagine watching all that talent leave and saying, it's okay because we've got Jackson Smith and Jigba. It's okay because we've got Julian Fleming, Emeka Egbuka. Remember those names? Marvin Harrison Jr. We've just got those names still here. If they need extra money up there, I've listened to Ryan Day talk about how they need $13-some-odd million to keep the team together. And in the NIL era, hey, sell tickets to practice. Because some of the best competition that you could see in this sport all year is happening in Columbus, Ohio on a random Tuesday in the wide receiver room. And in that wide receiver position grouping, that is a collection of talent the likes of which you will rarely see in this sport. Bama's had it recently with all those guys, and Ohio State's got it now. And outside of that, I don't think you see that anywhere. You can count any position group, anywhere. That kind of collection of talent after losing who they just lost is amazing. Let's kind of stay on the offensive side, but let's go specifically to tight end. The Georgia tight end room is nasty. It's loaded too. I don't think there's a close second here. I think Utah fans would have an argument, but I don't think it's particularly close. Let's go back a couple of recruiting cycles since we're talking about recruiting cycles of years past. Remember the year Darnell Washington and Eric Gilbert were coming out, and how there was this widely held belief that they weren't going to play for the same school. That's not rare. You hear that from time to time. Premier players, they want to go be their own player. They want to go stand out somewhere, whatever. Well, that was thought about those two. So Darnell Washington goes to Georgia. Eric Gilbert goes to LSU. And then he was at Florida for like 5 minutes, but then he ends up at Georgia. Anyway, my point is, imagine telling yourself 2 years ago, the top two players at that position, Darnell Washington and Eric Gilbert, are going to be playing on the same team a couple of years from now, and neither of them are going to be considered the best at their position because of a guy that at that point no one even knows exists, named Brock Bowers, is going to come in and outshine all of them. That's the status, or the status, depending on where you reside from, that Georgia's tight end room's in right now. You want to know about depth? How many of you know the name Oscar Delp? Georgia fans excluded. How many of the rest of you out there? If you're in Amarillo, Texas, have you ever heard of Oscar Delp? No? Chances are he'd probably start for your program and be a very, very high-level contributor at tight end for your program. He's their fourth best tight end right now. And in time, he's going to be a really good one. I think he's really good now. It's just how deep they are. So Georgia's tight end room, yeah, the envy of the rest of the country. And last but not least, let's go to Texas. Because the running back room there, it's kind of a different deal when you're talking running backs. If you've got Bijan Robinson, he kind of makes 80% of the argument. Bijan Robinson is a guy who most everyone considers the top running back in the country, or at the very least, number one, number two. I've got him number one, if that matters to you at all. But if you look past him, Rashawn Johnson is still there, averaged about 6 yards per carry last year, and a guy that I'm sky high on, that really hasn't gotten to be a feature guy yet, but I think will once Bijan Robinson exits the premises, is Keelan Robinson, transfer from Alabama last year. I think Keelan Robinson is a really good player. So they go three deep there with really, really high-level guys. Those position groups, if you want to look past it, you can look at Jonathan Brooks. Those position groups, though, when you talk about conference championship races and when you talk about looking at over-under win totals and how this sport's played at the highest level, a lot of one-possession games, a lot of like back and forth, and you're trying to do the win-win, loss-win-loss. You're trying to map out someone's season. If you would do nothing more than just go find the most loaded position groups and just bet disproportionately on those teams, I think you'd be shocked at how profitable it would turn out for you, especially at the water cooler. Now, if you're facing off against odds makers in Vegas, that's one thing. But at the water cooler, yeah. So know all those names.